Hello everyone, and welcome to the second session of Digital Classicist London 2026. This session is online, and if you're joining us on YouTube, please do feel free to write in the chat where you're joining up from. Please also post any questions or comments you have in the chat, and we will address them all after the presentation. As a heads up, the abstract of this presentation should be showing below in your YouTube screen, along with the links to the Pedestal 3D platform that our speakers are referring to, and there is another link there to the next sessions of the Digital Classicist London 2026. So today's speakers are Dr. Alina Kozlovski and Associate Professor Sarah Lawrence from the University of New England, Australia. They are going to be talking to us about the process of creating an online exhibition with the Pedestal 3D platform and using digitized artifacts from the University of New England's Museum of Antiquities. Amongst other things, they will also be addressing the cultural categorization of ancient objects and what we gain or lose by doing so. So now I will pass over to Alina and Sarah and their presentation entitled A Museum of Words and Deeds, Combining Artifacts and Latin Texts in an Online Exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having us, and also thank you for everyone who's joining live and whoever is also maybe watching later on. So I'm Alina Kozlovski. I'm the Senior Lecturer of Digital Innovation in Ancient History and Archaeology at the University of New England. And so I will be speaking today with my colleague Sarah.
And hello, I'm Sarah Lawrence. I'm the Charles Tesoriero Associate Professor in Latin at UNE. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from Anawan country, unceded Anawan country, and also to acknowledge the Dungari, Gumbayan and Gamilaroi peoples, all of whom have strong connections to this land.
We're actually in different places in Australia. I'm actually on Wongal country at the moment, so lots of different places and lots of different histories. So today we're going to tell you about a project that we've had for about the last year or so, which combines our two sets of expertise. So Latin literature and language for Sarah, and museology, ancient material culture, and digital humanities from me. And through this collaboration, we've created an online exhibition using digitized artifacts from our university's museum collection. More recently, we also had actually, apart from the online exhibition, we had a small display on site in the actual museum, which used the original artifacts and 3D prints as well. So physical, but also interacting with digital tech. I will show you that a bit at the end. And we also have a chapter on all of this currently under review for a volume on representations of ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean in museums. Now, before we talk about our own online exhibition, I just want to give some context for this medium. So online exhibitions have existed for quite a while. I mean, if you look online, you can even find ones from the 90s. These ones on my slide are a few recent examples from different institutions around Australia. And there are, of course, lots of online exhibitions of Greek and Roman materials as well. Now, some things to note. Now, when we think about this, when we were creating this online exhibition, we're really thinking about how to tell the story in this digital medium that is sort of mediated through a screen. So really thinking about storytelling and how it works. So sometimes there are different ways that people do this with online exhibitions. So sometimes they are essentially digital twins. So, or basically you might think of that as a method of documenting a physical display that exists physically in a museum. So an example of that is in the top left and also the bottom right. So if you were to go look these exhibitions up, you'd basically on your screen be able to walk through a 3D space on your device and then stop in certain places, click on certain things, and it's basically showing what the actual space of the museum looked like in 3D, but still always kind of flat on the screen, right? This type of online exhibition does create a record for the museum of their past physical exhibitions, though, as we know, with all digital things, these don't necessarily last forever if the website is changed or there's no hosting space. And then there are also other online exhibitions that are more like websites. So like, for example, the Small Town Queer in the top right, this has a main landing page and you can click on things and then navigate to other pages. So it's sort of like exhibition as a website. As far as I know, this one actually didn't exist in the physical space. So it's essentially also a supplementary online resource for a physical museum. Our exhibition was neither of these. We'll show you shortly. Firstly, it actually started online, and then it went physical, so it kind of went backwards. And the physical version is not exactly the same, was not exactly the same as the original online version. And our exhibition is one web page where you scroll down to follow the story. So rather than having like a landing page with hyperlinks, in the museum world, this type of you go on one page and scroll down, this type of storytelling is actually often called scrollytelling. So scrolly. Now, our exhibition, called the Museum of Words and Deeds, uses 6 artifacts from our university's Antiquities Museum. The museum itself has about, I think, 3,000 artifacts or so, largely ancient Mediterranean, though there are some actually from Roman Britain, for example, as well, plus some from other regions in the world. Now, a lot of our teaching at our university is done online because our students come from all over the country, sometimes internationally as well, including in Australia, especially in non-metropolitan areas, so sometimes even quite remote areas. So this is why we do a lot of online stuff. As a result, our museum has had quite a long-standing digitization project where staff from the learning media team and the archaeology lab create digital models using both various 3D scanners and photogrammetry. And these are hosted on this platform called Pedestal 3D, which is an Australian platform that is used by a number of different institutions. It is a commercial platform that the university is a client of. And like I said, it's used by a number of different institutions. So including, there's a few other universities that use it, there's a few museums that use it, and also some local councils for various heritage collections. You can use the QR code on the screen if you like, where you can have a look at the setup of our various collections on your phone. Now, before we go further into the ideas behind our online exhibition and how we use the digital medium within it, we'll now just quickly show you what it looks like. So I think can we please put a link in the chat if it's not there already? So it's live, so you can have a look at it. Let me just change my screen. So hopefully you can see, yeah, okay. So as I said, this uses the scrollytelling modality. So it's just one page and then you scroll down. And it's actually also, I said Pedestal 3D hosts the digital objects, but also actually hosts pages. So our exhibition is actually hosted in this digital platform. So now Sarah will introduce the exhibition briefly before we go into more detail.
Thank you so much, Alina. So if we have a look at this exhibition page, you'll see here that we start with some introductory text, and then we move down and provide an example of a cataloguing record from the museum and a manuscript of Valerius Maximus. There are lots and lots of those out there, explaining these items as we go, trying not to use too much text. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then we come down into the individual segments, these thematic segments, and the objects embedded within them. And as Alina can show you here, you can play with the object, you can move it around and look at it from all kinds of different angles. Within the information, you have the museum entry that tells you what's going on with the object. As you can scroll down and see all the data here, including, very importantly, the people who've done all the work of digitizing it. Then when we come out of this, we can go into the annotations. And there are 2 lots of annotations, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, that allow you to look at the different aspects of the object. And you see as you come down here, these other thematic categories that we've included, all of them including a text on the left, as well as this information embedded within the object scan itself. and an overarching conclusion, inviting people to think more about the ideas. And it was, in terms of the text here, very strongly informed by Alina's training and very much greater knowledge than mine in museum labelling. So I'm a very text-based scholar and teacher, and a lot of my research has focused on Valerius Maximus's factor dictum memorabilia. That's memorable words and deeds, or deeds and words. So you might be starting to see where our title comes from. The Facta Dicta is the only work we have remaining by Valerius, who created the text under the Emperor Tiberius. Valerius, who remains a pretty mysterious figure, produced our only remaining collection of exempla. So exempla were short stories or even simply references to an incident or individual, which the Romans used to encapsulate particular ideas or problems. These often featured famous people, but they could also get their heft from the power of the story rather than a person's name. Exempla were exceptionally important to Roman education, as many of you will know, also to argumentation, oratory, and philosophy. Valerius collected over 1,000 of these stories and created a curated, deeply interesting and complex work arranged into 9 books, each containing chapters on topics ranging from odd wisdom to on those who punished in others crimes they themselves had committed. And you can see here a woodcut of a potential Valerius Maximus. We know very, very little about him, and one of many manuscripts of Valerius Maximus. He's a writer who was sort of adored up until the mid-1600s and then despised up until fairly recently. He's very close to my heart, obviously. So within the chapters, and critically for our talk today, Valerius divided the exemplar into Roman and foreign stories, or internal and external, as they're often marked in editions. In part because of this choice of arrangement, Valerius has often been viewed by modern scholars as presenting a pretty bigoted view of the world, in which Roman exemplar are inevitably proudly superior to those from foreign individuals who are firmly segregated in the text. However, as I've argued elsewhere, and explained most fully in my forthcoming book, the seemingly firm line that Val draws between Roman and foreigner is consistently complicated and complicating. What appears to be a sharp curatorial distinction on Valerius's part often does more to reveal how blurry the line really is between the categories. So, as Alina mentioned, in response to a call for contributions to a volume called Representations of Ethnicity in the Ancient World, we decided to use a digital exhibition to explore the concept of categorization into different group memberships, combining Valerius's curation with the way in which objects in the physical Unema collection had been catalogued and categorized over time. In a series of discussions, we settled on 3 themes, each illustrated by 2 objects from Unema and 2 matching story from Valerius's memorable words and deeds. When we thought about how to explore the process by which objects and people were and are separated into categories of group membership, we also took the opportunity to think about how much separation there often is between our use of ancient objects and texts, and how we might challenge this distinction by finding different ways to include both strands. In a very collaborative process, we played with a range of possibilities for some time before we came up with the idea of embedding scans of the objects within pedestal, as you've just seen, framed by this overarching information. The art of trying to keep our text as close to the style of museum labels as possible was a genuine education for me, as Alina patiently and ruthlessly cut back my text and explained the art of conveying ideas in the briefest possible sentences for the widest readership. With this framing text in place, we annotated each digital scan in 2 different ways. We'll talk about that a bit more later. But in short, one set were designed to explore the object's physical qualities, and the other designed to embed a thematically connected exemplum on the surface of the scanned object, like a series of flags by which a viewer could follow the story. So when it came to selecting appropriate exemplar from Valerius Maximus, our focus was on stories in which the author explicitly engaged with the question of group membership by problematizing or celebrating stories where the boundaries are blurred. Valerius's constant structural engagement with the line between Roman and foreign makes him a useful observer of those points which confound the clear division he uses. Some chapters were obviously promising, such as 3.6 and Valerius is not a whiz with titles, or whoever came up with the titles for his work, so forgive me. Illustrious men who humoured themselves in their dress or in the rest of their lifestyle with greater freedom than the customs of our ancestors would allow. But relevant stories were also found throughout the collection, including in chapters on people who were born in humble circumstances but ended up famous, things freely spoken or done, and on chastity. The stories we selected from Valerius also came from both the internal, the Roman exemplar, and the external exemplar. So the exemplar on chastity is an external story provided by German women who were prisoners of war. The illustrious man is internal, a Roman, and the man who speaks freely is from Privernum, an Italian community at war with Rome at the time of the story, but the story is classified as Roman. This will start to give you a sense that the cultural divisions are not as straightforward as they might first appear.
Just as Valerius Maximus used the idea of sort of culture categories, as Sarah was just explaining, to organize his text and his stories about people, museums also place objects into culture categories in their catalogues and then in exhibitions. So these are a few examples of the catalogues that you can find online. I'm sure if you've ever used an online museum catalogue, you've come across some kind of architecture like this, where you have various drop-down lists or checkboxes with different sort of cultural categories that objects have been made to fit into. And they sort of separate these objects into these different groups. Now, thinking about the process and effect of these practices is often called critical cataloging, and this has been explored in quite a bit in museology, in archival studies, and library and information studies as well. And the constructivist nature of categories and the harms that they can produce for those outside positions of power and authority is a recurring theme and concern in critical cataloging. Objects can get also new identities when they enter museum collections and catalogs. So Burke, for example, has called this idea of how objects change their identities institutional alchemy, because this type of documentation and categorizing practice can actually make an object into something else. And this might have started historically on paper, but then digital contexts also continue this and interact with it in different ways as data fields are set up and then need to be filled, and things like keyword searches make blurry or slippery ideas difficult to document and then also to find. In addition to that, so in their work on classification, Bowker and Starr argue that any act of classification, as happens with museum objects, for example, is as much material as it is symbolic. So with things like paper forms or software instructions that are encoded in silicon and plastic keys, all having an effect on how these acts of classification are implemented. In their work on libraries, meanwhile, Adler and Harper argue for a spatial and material understanding of classification and its effects. So for example, you find these when you walk through stacks and browse through shelves and look at the placement of books. And all of this is, of course, quite relevant for museum displays and for their storage rooms. All of these physically settle categories into space. And if you think about the physicality of interacting with different categorizing systems on a screen, like on our pedestal site, where not on our exhibition, but on the pedestal site where I had the QR code before, which takes you to the main page where you can look through our collections, the different cultures are essentially each given a square that you click on, right? And then you move either your mouse or your thumb or your fingers on your screen. And so there's a physicality to how they create categories and also how you interact with them. And of course, when we're talking about categories for ancient objects, for the ancient Mediterranean materials, this is all quite relevant. So if we think about the categories themselves, so the distinction of what exactly makes something Greek or Roman or Egyptian, what makes an object, any of those, or a combination or other, can be difficult to explain, especially when you have museum labels that have to be very short. And then other sets of data like known find spots can only complicate the issue. So as artifacts made in or inspired by styles that originate from elsewhere can acquire several cultural labels. Similarly, broad categories like Greek and Roman can obscure local complexity, while hyphenated designations such as Gallo-Roman can work to set cultures in opposition, assume familiarity against unfamiliarity, and also then attribute visual markers, because we're talking about objects, to both. Now, some of these ideas about the history and effects of cataloging practices have been explored or touched on in exhibitions in the past. So I just have a few examples here that I've collected in my various travels. So, for example, this exhibition on provenance research in African arts from the Fowler Museum in Los Angeles a few years ago placed original catalog cards, which they call flimsy cards historically, on display with explanations of their features. I'm sorry for the photo quality, I was doing this with my phone, but really sort of bringing the behind the scenes acts of cataloging into the display for the viewing public. Some of the cards needed quite a lot of explanation because they used outdated terms, and these were still put on display, but then hidden behind removable covers, so as you can see on the right. So another example, a video on display at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum entitled Objects in Inventory Land, Repairing the Collection. So this was a video created where it basically sort of whimsically showed objects sort of pattering around storage, finding their own catalog cards, and settling into boxes after a hunt for their biographies and lost histories. There have also been in the past interesting ways that institutions have used the architecture of labeling practice to point out sort of cataloging histories and object histories and futures. So with the ancient Greek and Roman material, we don't have the artist line very often because we don't know the artist most of the time. But in a typical museum label, like if you have a painting or something, you have the artist. When it comes to, for example, Australian Indigenous materials, sometimes or many times the creator, the artist, the maker was not recorded. So museums have gone around different ways of how to sort of make obvious that story. So, and also pay respect to the cultures and their beliefs. So as an example here at the Australian Museum, the sort of maker line actually was in this exhibition was made by ancestor. And then this is not from an exhibition, this is from the online catalogue of the Powerhouse Museum, also in Sydney. The Indigenous curatorial team have also referenced this object being made by an ancestor, but framed it as ancestor not yet recorded. It also says location not yet recorded and date not yet recorded. So demonstrating through the traditional object database framework that learning about these objects is ongoing. Now, aside from the cataloging story, one thing that Sarah's noted is that we're really interested in combining objects with text, right? Or ancient objects with text. Just to give a bit of background also to this type of practice. Now, ancient Greek and Roman texts do sometimes get mentioned in exhibitions. So, for example, if you've ever seen an exhibition on Pompeii, there are a lot of those. Pliny the Younger probably comes up at some point. Sometimes quoted directly, sometimes just in passing. But here are just a few other examples that I've collected. This one, I saw this exhibition a few days ago. It's on right now in Melbourne. So this one doesn't have quotes, but so it's an exhibition about, Rome, people, empire, power, that sort of, it's very typical sort of themes we might expect. But on a few labels, they do mention what Ovid, Livy, and Seneca say. So just a little bit of a mention of some of the ancient writers. This one is another example of this. So this was an exhibition I actually worked on in Los Angeles at the Getty Villa. You can see me looking at this statue as if it was for the first time, even though I'd spent months staring at it already in the photo. So this was about the Villa of the Papyri. The whole exhibition was about that. And one of my tasks for this was to read all of Philodemus's works and find some quotable quotes, which is not that easy with Philodemus. And then we took them and put them on the walls. And the reason being was that they found a whole bunch of Philodemus's text in the scroll, in the discovered charred scrolls. We also had direct quotes from, or translated ones though, from Lucretius and Epicurus as well for the same reason. And then just one more example of sort of the use of ancient text in an exhibition. This one is quite interesting. This is a rare multimedia display. Again, apologies for the terribleness of my phone photos, but this is from the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, where they have a panel with a section of Vitruvius's text on architecture in English and Latin, and there is an audio recording of the Latin. And so visitors are encouraged to engage with the spoken Latin directly and see if they can follow along the displayed text as the audio plays. And as you can see, it's sort of part of a section on Roman houses. Now, for the most part, efforts such as these to mix ancient texts and objects introduce sort of a process of meaning making about the past into exhibitions, which kind of recalls an antiquarian's practice because it's quite anecdotal, right? So it's sort of made up with individual stories without necessarily direct connections, and organized by association. So the association between the ancient text and the object is not always very obvious, apart from maybe the Pliny example. We have he talks about the eruption, and we have stuff from the eruption. But the objects and the text are not always from the same period or place. Our exhibition is like this too, right? So what we did was basically combine objects with culture categories that were complicated in some way, thematically with stories from Valerius Maximus' text. The objects we picked and Valerius Maximus were not from the same time and place. There's no claim that he ever saw these objects or even objects like these, or any assemblage that was of objects that was like this. So our curation online is an act of decontextualization in the traditional sense, but the recontextualization happens thematically. Now, that gives you a bit of an idea of sort of the broader framework of what we're doing, and also what's out there already done by others. Now, for our exhibition, to make it all happen, I went looking for complicated culture categories in our museum's collection, both in the paper files and in the digital catalogue. And I found, for example, an object inventory card that's on the left with a line of black printed text, right? So you can see it says Roman terracotta lamp with comic mask. And then you can see in pen, someone at some point has crossed out Roman and then rewritten Roman again. So the lamp was Roman, then it was not Roman, and then it was Roman again. And this sort of, the objects struck out Romanness, and its reinstatement represents a sequence of thinking, rethinking, and thinking back. It's a trail of thought which then turned slippery when its author sought to attribute a culture to this object. Now, the digital collection management system that we use is called Past Perfect, and that has free-form data fields. So for site and place of origin, and then while culture labels actually tend to be placed in the description field. And beyond simply sort of browsing through the collection and trying to find examples where the culture categories were not very obvious, the fact that in our field we use these, and not just in our field, but we use these hyphenated compound adjectives, that really works really well with the typical searching system, because basically I searched hyphens, right? So if I search up hyphen, I found a Gallo-Roman figurine, a Romano-Egyptian Harpocrates figurine, an Etrusco-Corinthian kylix, and a late Roman-early Byzantine lamp. And these are some of the objects that we've picked for the exhibition.
Which just goes to show how important punctuation is. So we had a concept. Alina had identified some likely objects and some interesting cataloguing information. And I had pointed out some interesting exemplar from Val's collection. And sorry, it's a bad habit of calling Valerius Val. Now, all we had to do was think about themes that could provide lenses through which both the stories from the text excerpts and the artifact interpretation histories could be viewed, beyond the broader subject of culture, ethnicity, and group membership. We settled in the end on 3 themes to reflect the different ways that categories of culture are complicated or blurred, which felt representative of both the material and literary evidence. The first category which occurred to us was the most obvious, that of appearance. Some of the most dominant models of group membership in the modern world have been predicated on the idea that the physical appearance of individuals reveals significant information about and often defines them as particular categories of humanity. The aftermath of the enslavement of Black people in the USA provides one of the key paradigms, with a focus on physiognomics that makes the question of whether an individual could pass as white central to their experience of nearly every aspect of civil life. A similar focus on appearance was particularly critical in the cataloguing of objects, as experts have attempted to determine the origin of objects based on their stylistic features. In Valerius Maximus's text, the most prominent visual indicator of group membership is clothing, associated with particular groups. As he demonstrates, however, the information conveyed by a person's clothing can be at odds with their actual identity. So too when it comes to the figure of Harpocrates from the Eunaema collection. In our exhibition text, we explain, labelled both Romano-Egyptian and a Greco-Roman version of an Egyptian god in the museum's files, this mix of labels can make it harder to figure out where to place the object. The Egyptian aspects of the statuette have clearly had a strong influence on curators, though we can see from the mentions of Greece and Rome that they had reason to believe that this was not a straightforwardly Egyptian piece. So we paired this with a story from Valerius, in which a Roman called Marcus Volusius, who, when targeted by the three men, the triumvirs, who, contrary to Roman political custom, were ruling Rome between themselves at the time, escaped from the city dressed as a priest of Isis, a cult fundamentally associated with Egypt. Valerius expresses horror about both the threat to Volusius's life and Volusius's life-saving strategy, saying, "Oh, these men are either too lustful for their own lives, or those men are too greedy for the death of others, who either stay alive by these methods or force others to endure them." Valerius shows how easily a person's superficial appearance, and it doesn't get much more superficial than clothing, can change a viewer's categorization of that person. Volusius managed to escape Rome successfully despite the substantial price on his head, because observers, looking at his clothes, wrongly identified him as a foreigner on the basis of his appearance. The second category in our online exhibition came from the idea that sometimes we categorize people or objects on the basis of how they behave or how they interpret their role or function. In the modern world, we might think of the example of Mahmoud Gassama, who was granted French citizenship in 2018 for an act of extraordinary bravery, which saw him scale the outside of a building to rescue a child. The official decree noted, "This act of great bravery exemplifies the values which help unite our national community, such as courage, selflessness, altruism, and taking care of the most vulnerable." That is, the grant of French citizenship was articulated to express the idea that Gassama's behaviour was sufficiently French to warrant legal recognition of his citizenship. Similarly, in Valerius Maximus's ancient worldview, behaving like a Roman could be enough to make you an honorary or even legal Roman. The exemplum we chose to illustrate this comes from his chapter concerning people who rose to an outstanding position from a lowly birth, or 3.4. Valerius describes Rome's decision to adopt Tarquinius to be their king. This is noteworthy because Tarquinius, who according to legend went on to be the fifth of 7 kings of Rome, wasn't a Roman. As Valerius put it, he was foreign because he came from Etruria, more foreign because he was born in Corinth. Tarquinius was considered to be from Etruria, and his father was originally from Corinth, making him an external 2 times over. Nevertheless, Valerius stresses that when it came to behaviour, Tarquinius was exactly in line with Roman needs and values. In his final assessment of Tarquinius, Valerius declares, "He brought it about by his outstanding qualities that this state, that is Rome, felt no regret that it had borrowed a king from neighbouring territories rather than chosen one from its own." So despite his origin story, nothing about Tarquinius's conduct separated him from the Roman group. Now, objects, of course, cannot really act unless they're in that really lovely whimsical display that Alina referred to, but they can certainly reflect a particular functional design. For this reason, we teamed Tarquinius with the drinking cup, the kylix, mentioned above, which, like many artefacts, is kind of inscrutable in terms of its own origin story. This cup is believed to have been crafted by Etruscans in Italy, but takes its design cues from artists operating in Corinth, Greece. When it comes to cataloguing, it was difficult to know where to place this cup to reflect its origin, which is why it became Etrusco-Corinthian. Valerius, on the other hand, puts Tarquinius firmly in the Roman category, judging that this was the most important thing a reader should know about the king. The third and final category we considered dealt with cases where official categories were in tension with other kinds of group membership. These tensions are familiar in a modern political context where, for instance, an individual might feel an allegiance to their heritage in one country, but be formally a citizen of another. In the modern world, this may happen when migrants or refugees from one country struggle with the question of how to integrate, assimilate, or acculturate the cultural identity of their country of birth within the context of their new residences. And certainly a number of our colleagues at UNE are permanent residents in Australia, but still choose to retain their original citizenship. One of the two objects we chose to represent the complexity of superficially straightforward formal designations is an oil lamp decorated with a human face. In the exhibition text, we ask if the lamp is from Egypt, but made in a period during which Rome held possession of Egypt. Is it then Egyptian or Roman, or should we turn to Romano-Egyptian when we label it to recognize the mixture of categories? The processes of imperial or colonial expansion obviously create many opportunities for confusions of group membership, even when we're only looking from the perspective of the expanding power. In Valerius's text, there are a number of points where he touches on the collisions of identity these dynamics can create. For instance, on his chapter on frank statements and actions, he tells the story of the Italian town of Privernum. I love this story, which, after an unsuccessful revolt against Rome in 329 BCE, refused to compromise their dignity in negotiations with the victorious power. A leading citizen from the community responded to the question of what kind of punishment he thought Privernum deserved with the kind of punishment fitting for people who think themselves worthy of freedom. When the Romans tried again and asked what kind of a peace they could expect if they were to spare them, the same leading man responded, well, if it's a good peace, everlasting. If it's a bad one, brief. Perhaps contrary to expectations, Valerius Maximus notes that the Romans were so impressed by the outspoken frankness of the Italians that they rewarded them with Roman citizenship. In this instance, Valerius Maximus calmly mixes two categories which, in this story, were very recently at war. He states that it was the free Italian blood of the people of Privernum which guaranteed that they were welcomed into the Roman community. This may seem insignificant on current geographical lines, but we ought to keep in mind that Italian cities would go on to fight a fierce war with Rome to secure their own citizenship in the 80s BCE, 250 years later than the setting of this incident. More than this, Valerius Maximus goes against his own principles of organization by putting this exemplum as the first Roman exemplum in chapter 6.2, despite the fact that the incident precedes the grant of citizenship. Here, the expansion of Roman control is conceived in such a way that it both recognizes and collapses the distinct membership of the two groups involved. This is obviously not the direct equivalent of labeling the oil lamp as Romano-Egyptian, perhaps more something like Roman because it is very Egyptian. But it indicates a similar thought process by which even the most straightforward official designations of group membership can contain recognition of a far messier reality.
So we wrote short labels that combine these stories, as Sarah's just been pointing out, the stories of the complications in object labeling and then the complications of group membership in Valerius Maximus. And then using the 3D digital models of the objects in the online exhibition gave us actually some interesting options then to add more content through annotations. So let me just go back to this. So if you've ever worked with digital objects like this, you've probably seen this type of thing where a number of different platforms, this is not just available in Pedestal, where you can add basically little dots or numbered dots that then if the viewer clicks on them, things appear. So this is an example from another platform called Sketchfab, which I'm sure many of you have interacted with before. And those annotations can be used in various ways, but often they sort of give extra information. And sometimes they specifically refer to whatever the annotation is actually stuck onto. So like in this case, we have a bronze deposit on this pot. By the way, this is the page from the University of Auckland. I just picked another example from our side of the world. And what these annotations can do is, apart from giving more information, they also can sort of create a path of travel for a viewer over the object's surface. Sometimes they also have, so here's just another example. in this case, they've added lots of hyperlinks as well. So they, for example, give you comparanda. So it's kind of a very simple but interesting and potentially fruitful way to add more information about an object. I also want to show you another example from Pedestal from us. So this is not an object that we have in our collections. We just have the model. Pedestal allows for annotations as well, and so our lithics specialist, this original object is, I think, an Australian collection, but it's actually an early British object of a stone tool. And then so what this platform allows is where you have the little pins, but then also the information actually appears on the side, and there's actually sort of you can kind of create an itinerary down the page because the annotations are listed in this way. Now, thinking beyond objects in the study of ancient texts, the broader idea of annotation has been a long-standing process to both think through and illuminate aspects of a work through close analysis, right? So whether it's objects or text, I mean, we all come from the world of studying gobbets, right? And sometimes if we study the manuscript tradition, we also all know about marginalia. So marginalia, which have been added to ancient texts in different editions over the centuries, are considered important parts of a text history. So although intervening in a text with annotations has had its critics, there's also much to be gained when the annotations themselves are viewed as deliberate actors in a storytelling strategy. So a place of storytelling like an exhibition is as well. Now, in her work on contextual annotation within historical fiction, Golden argues that annotations work to create an ideal reader, right? So she's talking about text, who's ultimately a version of the annotator themselves, as their additions to the main text elucidate their interpretation of it. As such, a set of annotations is kind of analogous to a curation, right? So a set of annotations in a text is sort of like curating the text for your reader, while here we might have putting annotations on an object is where a curator makes deliberate choices about how to suggest a mode of viewing for a set of artifacts or images, and then also direct the viewer's gaze, but also their mouse or their fingers on a screen.
So as a means of creating a bridge between the material and the literary, we were eager to ensure that the original text translation was part of the display. One of the benefits of the digital setting was the ability to include those extra sets of text in a way that they could be easily hidden from immediate view and so would not encumber, distract, or terrify people who were looking at the main narrative. If a viewer wants to delve deeper, however, the text is easily accessible in the same visual context as the objects. In our annotations, yellow pins represent sections of Valerius Maximus's text, while purple pins add extra information and ideas about the objects. In the case of the yellow annotations, we've framed the digital journey with the instruction to users to follow Valerius Maximus over the object, and each annotation is titled as a step in the journey. This deliberately muddles the boundaries between ancient author, modern translator, modern annotator, and modern viewer, all now anchored in the physical, albeit digitized object in different ways through these annotation pins. Though we placed the annotations, it was Valerius Maximus who wrote the text, and the viewer is free to read them in or out of order. As we consciously worked to render the text responsive to the physicality of the objects, we made choices like positioning the yellow annotation markers, and I'll let Alina find him, on the figurine of the young man to create a kind of girdle across his waist. Given the associated story from Valerius Maximus is about gender and chastity, it seemed appropriate to use a configuration on the figurine's body that also drew attention to these issues. The girdle was a piece of clothing linked to both maturity and sexuality in the Roman world. The poet Catullus, of course, uses the image of a girdle being tied close to represent a woman's choice to retain her virginity. And in another poem refers explicitly to a virgin girdle. So this playful reference on our part is subtle, but has the potential to help viewers form subconscious connections between text and object. On the Etrusco-Corinthian kylix, we've also taken the annotations as an opportunity to bring the object's ancient maker into view. Here, Valerius Maximus traces us around the object's rim, And following the ancient story in this way, annotation to annotation, makes the 3D object spin on the screen. This motion, now unlikely to be permitted with the original artifact, mirrors the visual experience of the cup's ancient potter as they created it on a wheel. This circular motion creates the circular motion this creates also alludes to the Wheel of Fortune, a common symbol in the Roman world, which represented the way in which fortune could move someone from top to bottom, prosperity to desperation in one spin. This seemed an appropriate resonance for a story about Fortune's selection of an outsider, Tarquinius, for the position of King of Rome.
Sorry, my slide has links, so it keeps reopening the web page. So sorry, I just will go forward across. So since creating the online version, just to finish up, we'll just very quickly tell you about the physical one that we made in the museum afterwards. So like I said, the online one came first. So this one used the actual artifacts themselves and 3D prints of them, which were made larger than the originals. And it was all localized in one case. So you can see the ancient objects in the front. And then at the back, we had some 3D prints. Like I said, they were enlarged. So this is a lamp and the kylix again, but the 3D print is bigger than the original. And then on that, Sarah wrote Valerius Maximus's text in Latin. Sarah also created this fabric background that you can see that also has the same text. So creating very deliberately a very visually busy look. And the idea was to make the objects really busy with words. We also created an accompanying pamphlet that explains some of the ideas that we've talked about today.
So from my point of view, this is kind of an amazing circular thing that happened with this exhibition, in the sense that this concept of putting the things together digitally ended up with a physical reality that was entirely dependent on the digital. So the fabric was digitally printed, the objects obviously 3D printed, but the act of printing them allowed me, as a super text person, to interact more closely physically with an ancient object than I ever had before, as I spent that time very, very carefully writing the text of Valerius over these objects, which meant that I was handling them constantly. So there's to my mind, a really beautiful nexus about the way in which the physical leads to the digital, leads back to the physical in this loop. And one of the things that you can't see in this image is that with a table next to the cabinet, we had the zines, those pamphlets that Alina just showed, but we also had some 3D prints that weren't included in the cabinet, so people could pick them up and hold them and play with them themselves.
And though both the online version and the museum version dealt with the same objects, like I said, I want to make it, it's like to us is quite important. They're actually, and it explored similar themes, they're actually not exactly the same, right? So like I said, the look of the physical version was quite different, and deliberately so. And the 3D prints were used in a different way to the digital models, in a different sort of notion of, I guess, annotation. Because firstly, for example, the digital models had English translations of Valerius Maximus's text, while the 3D printed versions had his Latin text on them. So while the digital annotations of English text can direct how a viewer interacts with the digital objects by sort of creating a path, here the Latin text itself was behind perspex and literally untouchable, and so used more so for visual effect. And I think this happens a lot in society today. Most people don't know how to read Latin, but visually, if you see, oh, that looks like Latin, it means something, right? For better or for worse. Like I said, Sarah said, we did also put some true to size 3D prints on the table nearby, but these blown up ones really became, at least to me, physical manifestations of how objects in museums are always made to bear the weight of written words, right? So whether it's the ancient texts through which so much ancient material culture has been viewed and interpreted, or through historical and contemporary cataloging practices, which use text to make meaning about material culture. So both versions were sort of experiments in using digital models and 3D prints in different ways.
And for me, one of the single most exciting things about this project, because ever since I've been fortunate enough to have Alina as my colleague, I've become so much more aware of how the material culture can be used and can add to what we are doing with text, is that the digital dimension of those 3D objects, of what can be done within Pedestal, what can be done with digital techniques like these 3D printing or the 2D printing, is a way to bring the written and the material together in a way that would be very, very difficult to do without these digital affordances. So to my mind, it helps us very materially towards another step in scholarship, which one might not expect.
Okay, that's it from us. So thank you, everybody.
So thank you very much indeed, Alina and Sarah, for this highly stimulating presentation on the different methods of digital presentations and how online and physical exhibitions can actually be combined. I particularly liked the last reference to the circular nature, from jumping between the digital, the material, the textual, and back again. And so that was really great to see. I'm not sure if we have any questions online. I seem to have an issue with seeing them. So if not, then I might be permitted to ask one of my own. So something that I found very interesting to appreciate is that the questions of categorization were already present in the Latin texts, as you, Sarah, said in your discussion on Valerius Maximus. But equally how today a critical classification in museum displays or even your platform requires really careful thought processes, and that it's absolutely an ongoing task. So in that vein, what would be interesting for me would be, you say that you took about 6 objects out of, I believe you said more than 3,000 objects in the museum. So are there any plans to broaden that scope from 6 to maybe a few more objects?
For the online exhibition, I actually was quite happy that only a few were so easily findable, just because also, I mean, you know, exhibitions are a particular genre, whether they're online or in person. Keeping a person's attention is quite a task. So especially with this very highly theoretical material. In this case, we're also competing with the story with the 3D models, which just they're interesting, but they also distract to some extent. And also, and this is something for everyone, but also because we wanted to show this to our students, a lot of our students are remote and don't have the best internet access. So these digital models actually take a lot of internet to load. So I was always quite keen to limit it, to not go, you know, also, you know, like how long do people want to scroll down, and that sort of stuff is something to think about. So yeah, so at this point we don't have any sort of, maybe we could make a second episode, for example. But for this, I think, yeah, we'll keep it small. And it was also helpful with the physical one because we could keep it in a case as well. So and it allowed the chaos to be really, with words, really obvious because it was so contained in one Perspex case. Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to say, look, you know, there's your pitch for a textbook, Alina. A really genuinely digital textbook.
Mm-hmm. I know Valerius obviously also has many more stories that could be used. So it's like our title started with, I think we were writing the original abstract for the volume, and Sarah said Valerius's text is like a museum of words, I think it was. And so, yeah, so I like that parallel. Sorry, that's sort of a tangent, but yeah, but basically he has also lots of stories that obviously can be used.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I really enjoyed that, and especially the circularity that you talked about at the end. That was striking me all the way through. That not only was it sort of going full circle, but that you were trying. you were trying to replicate features of an exhibit, an exhibition, the way we imagine it, which is generally, in-person exhibit, in the digital form. But then in the in-person exhibit you built, you were trying to replicate features of the digital exhibit as well, and that was more than circular. That was they were really sort of feeding into each other. And I mean, so the first one of my question is, I wonder if you wanted to say more about that and how the two fed into each other. But I have a very minor question to sort of tack on to that, which is about the 3D prints that you did. And just from my experience of doing, photogrammetry and other kinds of 3D modeling of some of the objects in our collection, and 3D printing them, I just wondered what either technology or post-processing methods you used to make the models good enough quality to print larger than life. Because if I'm even printing at real one-to-one scale, it can feel a bit clunky. But that's a very technical question that may or may not be of interest to anyone else. But the broader question, of how they fed into each other, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that.
I'll go with the first one, so the second one first because it's shorter. So we did it. We have to give absolute credit to so Jackson Schubert and Emma Watt from both our learning media team and our archaeology lab, who did all the scanning. Actually, the models already, I think, all existed before we did our exhibition, luckily, because they digitized a lot anyway. And then Emma was on that 3D printed them. So I don't actually, I don't actually know. I don't do any of the stuff myself. I think so. Some of the scans, like I said, were either with the like the handheld scanner thing, and some of them were using photogrammetry. Luckily, in terms of the 3D print and the blow up, we weren't that concerned about it being sort of perfect because it's all about the sort of visual effect, and we just wanted a big surface to write on. And I think the Kylix, the 3D printed Kylix, like, is very obviously a Kylix. The other ones are a bit more lumpy looking when they're just black and they become matte and lose sort of the texture of the ceramic and all that sort of stuff. But that was for our purposes, I think, okay. Sarah, do you have any thoughts about the first harder question?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I think that there are all sorts of really interesting things that happen there too, because one of the comments that Alina made about them being behind perspex, with the digital models that you can play with and turn, and you're kind of amongst the objects, as it were, and then we shut them back. We take these digital objects and shut them back behind glass. And it's kind of hysterical in some ways that they are essentially valueless objects in most cases. So it really plays with the idea of value and preciousness within a museum too. I full disclosure, I would completely believe that the 3D models that we left on the table would be swiped in the first day, right? They stayed the whole time. No one saw the 3D models, which blew my mind. But I kind of love the fact that, okay, we did have the precious originals in there as well, but so much focus was on these replicas. When I was writing on them, by the way, I did also try to play with the way I did the text. So I thought about what direction it could take on the shape of the object. And you can't see it in those images, but in some cases I would do things like make the name of the person in the exemplar larger in the text as I went along, or try to do something interesting with the curves of a face, or different things like that. So it's like my very invasive handling of the object then gets shut behind perspex. So I think that there's something also, a really interesting play that I hadn't thought about before your question, about access and exclusion for the viewer and for the people creating the exhibition as well.
I think, and also, like, because the whole idea is about blurring categories, the slipperiness of how we categorize things. I mean, the topic is maybe culture category, but I mean, here we're sort of playing with the slipperiness of digital versus analog, right, as well, because, yeah, like, you're looking at objects they're 3D, but they're on a flat screen. Like, I always, because I teach digital museums, I always, like, with students, like, it's 3D, but it's flat. What do we think about that, you know? It's clear, it's a performance of three-dimensionality, but it's through a flat screen. So this sort of, I guess it's a really interesting question because it kind of, like I said, we're sort of collapsing the categories within the curation as well, beyond the actual topic of the exhibition. We're collapsing digital and physical a bit.
I also felt it gave us like a really valuable opportunity to create Valerius Maximus merchandise. I was quite into that idea. It was actually an amazing coincidence because we were lucky enough to have Henrietta van der Blom visiting at the time, and she looked up at the fabric that we were putting into the cabinet and realized that the exemplum that you could see most clearly was one she was about to talk about.
Yeah, because she gave a public talk. Yeah,
it was also kind of like a really lovely moment of connection.
And the writing you put on the objects, you did that manually yourself with paint on a physical object? You didn't do that in the digital model and then 3D printed in multiple colors?
That was an exercise in intense mindfulness on my part. It was really interesting though, because I don't spend much time writing Latin, right?
Right.
So to actually sit there and focus, and as I said, to focus on the surface of the object in that way. And of course, as you've noted, and as Alina acknowledged, we're not going to have the clean precision of that surface. You've got the grain of the print, but you are still dealing with the contours of the object. So it's the most time I've spent kind of sitting with an object's materiality. So really, really exciting and interesting. And as I said, I kind of love that using this really new technology. I mean, I know some of it's not as new, but relatively very new technology creates a really old school experience, which is about physical touch and what the object feels like in your hands.
Thank you.
Catherine or Anna Clara, do you have any questions? Please.
I do, if that's all right. I found this super fascinating, and I really liked the way that the stories sort of led the viewers around the objects on the online exhibition. What I wanted to ask was if you had any visitor feedback from the online exhibition about this, and whether it turns out that people were following the stories around the object in the way that you'd intended, or they were sort of jumping through or looking at it in a different way. Did you manage to find out about how the viewers were then interacting with the objects online?
It's hard to know. I mean, the few examples I know, so we also used it in we did a module in a digital creative writing unit with using this, basically trying to inspire students to think of object surface as a narrative device and all that sort of stuff. So, and I think the students, the few things I heard, the students quite liked it. I don't know exactly what they actually did. I know that because we had a bit of a showcase about at our university during our research week of the various sort of what we call NTR, like non-traditional research outputs from our staff. I don't know what they're called in the UK, if it's the same. But basically a lot of the creative arts lecturers had music and all this. And then so we had our exhibition on an iPad. And so some academics really did everything and did it because we heard later, did it exactly as we intended. But that's a particular audience, so... but yeah, otherwise it's hard to know. I mean, our media team had told us sort of the page counts and stuff like that, but we don't have, I mean, it's also almost maybe, I don't know if there's an element of surveillance here, maybe, I don't know if Pedestal allows you to track who clicks what on, I don't know if I want to, but yeah, so I don't know any more than that, unfortunately.
It's a really good question though, and I guess in another version of this story or in a future iteration of this story, one could put in an ethics application and ask people about these things. We were thinking at one point about trying to do something with getting school kids onto campus to look at the exhibition if we still had the cabinet set up, to kind of play with that at the same time as exposing them to the digital exhibition. But these are things that we could still do in the future. I mean, and just to kind of be a really old school nerd about this, I said to you, most of my experience with objects has come directly via Alina. So believe it or not, at this point in my career, it was the first time I'd actually played with Roman objects. So when she let me look at things from the collection, but I just adore the fact that with the true to size prints, we can interact with them in our hands. And, you know, I know that I'm not saying anything original here, but we have a baby bottle in the collection. Feeding bottle, and when you hold it in your hand, it fits so well in a relatively small hand. It's really ergonomic, and it just lets you interact with these objects and really think about their embodied nature in a way that we really haven't been able to do in the past, because you can't just toss an ancient object around and see how it feels.
I find it really interesting the way that this digital approach can kind of illustrate the complementary nature of very text-based sources and, on the other hand, the material evidence. And the other thing that I also have just taken from your most recent comments is that we often hear things like, oh, well, digital stuff is just tech-based coding or something that anybody can do. So I think it's great that you accord transparency to the people who have done a lot of the digitizing work, because that's not always done. The other thing that I thought was cool was that it gives you the opportunity to kind of nudge people to continue thinking on certain aspects of stuff and sort of go away and mull it over. And the final thing that I found very interesting is that although this is a tech-based approach, it facilitates a sensory experience, which, as you've just explained, we don't really have, either because something's behind a glass case or because it's just not done. So I thought that was really, really cool. Thank you.
I will say in setting up the actual exhibition, I did play with the HTML a bit myself, which I haven't done since high school, right? But still, in the chapter that we wrote for this, I actually mentioned this very briefly, that, I mean, that's another layer of text. It's a very different kind of textual culture that is involved. And so part of the sort of personal reflection on the curatorial process, there was the labeling of the objects, there was the annotating of the objects, there was the dealing with the paper cards, all these different modalities of text, but there was actually also a bit of HTML, which is another language, another way of getting meaning across, also visually, text turned to a visual experience and stuff. I'm not going to claim like I'm a coder or anything like that, but there was a bit. So also with help from lots of others. All the people who have helped is mentioned on the bottom of the exhibition page.
And yeah, special shout out from my point of view to Emma, because I would just say blithely to Alina, well, can't we just do like bigger prints? And she was like, oh, I guess I could ask, because I don't know what is and isn't possible, right? I haven't got a clue. And then Emma would just calmly produce these fantastic objects with, like, to my mind, no appearance of effort. Which just
with the size, because I was like, okay, let's limit it to the size of the printer, right? Because it's a box, but then Emma was like, no, it's okay, we can make a giant if you want, I'll just stick them together, like. And I was like, okay, like, I'm gonna say we'll put a parameter of the case in the museum, and the case of the printer is gonna be a physical like boundary for us for this one, also because we don't want to use up all the filaments that we had in the lab. But yeah, so as in, yeah, she was very willing to make things as giant as we wanted, if we wanted to make them much more giant.
Which is also kind of like a joyful process of like creating connections too. Like, given that the whole work is about, and this is kind of my Pollyanna moment for the evening, but given that the whole work is about kind of categories and how blurred they are, we all know how siloed academia can be. I don't often wander up to the archaeology lab, right? But suddenly, I've got so much more appreciation for what's happening there and for the work that's being done there. And that is a weird distinction, right? You would really not think that someone who works on Latin texts and Greco-Roman history is that far away from the archaeologists. But it's a really lovely kind of point of creating connection as well.
And I love the connection you made also with the sort of creative practice and creative writing and so forth. I'm sort of thinking in terms of, if we imagine further cycles of this, you've the text you put on the 3D printed object was in a way not replicating the same experience, but it was drawing on the same sort of thing that you did with annotations in the online exhibit, which was very, very much a digital way of doing things. But if you were then to try and put that 3D object with writing on it into a digital space, that would have to be transformed again in a different way. And you'd I think quite quickly, if you're then trying to take the model from 3D imaging to 3D modeling, where you're creating something, building something using creativity rather than just trying to replicate something that already exists. And I mean, all 3D modeling is in a sense creative replication, right? Even if you're trying to create a millimeter perfect scan, but it's a slightly different genre of 3D digitization at that point.
You make me think of when I was talking to Sir Jackson, who's one of our learning media people who does a lot of the scanning with the handheld scanner, because he showed me how to do it. I don't do it myself. But first of all, it's such an interesting way of interacting with the object. There's almost like a choreography to it, just like there is a choreography to how we interact with museum objects, wearing gloves and all that sort of stuff. And there's a certain, it's almost like sculptural, how you have to move your arm around. And it also then reminded me of sort of, again, a bit tangential, but yeah, when I've worked in museums and talking to lighting people, because lighting people, one of them once was I sculpt with light. Right. So again, it's thinking about the object and in a sculptural way, but in a very different, the sort of metric of concern. So there's a sort of a lot of creativity involved in all of this. And then of course, the models that get created are not always exactly the same. And to me, that's actually super interesting because there's these surrogates that we create and stuff. And then, if you do the sort of, you scan it, you 3D print it, you scan it again, you get the sort of potential lossiness of, you lose detail, it becomes sort of pixelaty. Or because I've done a bunch of research on the history of plaster cast making, and we have some giant plaster cast collections in Australia, and I would call them abbreviations because the details, every time there's a copy of a cast of a copy of a cast of a you start to lose things, right? So, and it becomes this sort of softer surface that you can sort of try and figure out what the details once were. And so in the digital, it's a similar thing.
And of course, there are projects around that with translation of language as well, right? That you take the same story and you translate it and translate it from language to language. And there's actually been a project going on doing exactly that on campus amongst our modern languages colleagues. So.
I'll also plug, since we brought up the creative thing, because I have another project that I did last year and the year before with one of our creative writing academics, Dr. Ariella Van Leeuwen, where we used the baby feeder that Sarah mentioned. It's a Cypriot object, and we basically created this creative writing workshop around it, and we had all these prompts for creative writers. And the idea was, like I said before with the students, of thinking of the surface of the object as a narrative device. So the idea was that you create a story to fill in the gaps in the object's biography, and then you attach it to the object. So we either did it with Post-its on the 3D print, or actually, they would do it with Post-its on the 3D print, and then I would actually put annotations onto the digital model. So now we have versions of some of that model with all these creative stories that are interwoven from the different iterations of the workshop that we ran. So I've been playing with different ways of using annotations for a bit now.
Going full circle again, just this is very much a tangent, but I'm reminded that actually 10 years ago now, we had a presentation in this very series, the Digital Classicist London series, by Emma Payne, who was using plaster casts to study objects that the originals have since degraded. Right, so 150-year-old plaster cast. The plaster cast has been indoors in Cambridge, hasn't degraded over time. Originally, it was a less perfect version of the object than the original object. The object's been outdoors for 150 years. is now degraded, and you can computationally compare the two. So so I was just reminded of that. I'm not sure that's particularly relevant, but it's that whole, changing the direction of which we normally think of these things.
And actually, if we're going even more tangential, can anyone remember the name of the artist who does the casts of empty spaces, like the ghost casts of lost spaces?
I've heard of this. I don't know the name though. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a cast of an absence rather than a presence. There's probably something really interesting and very theoretical and brilliant for you to do with that, Alina, if you want to keep doing that.
I've used the line that absence takes up space in so many talks now. Often in reference to when museums take objects off display and that absence makes a message, but also in archaeology, of course, like if you one of my examples is always the posts from supposedly Romulus's hut, right? So the absence is like a sign of not actually his hut, of a hut, but yeah. But I think, yeah, I mean, because they have to kind of sculpt the absence in the 3D models, right? Because they can't scan inside the objects, because you can't stick the scanner inside it. So there is a sort of reverse, like recreate the cavity in reverse as a volume in its own right.
Thank you, Sarah Williams. That's exactly who it is. Much appreciated.
And I was going to say so in one of the museums that I mentioned in Sydney, the Powerhouse, where I used to work there, they have a collection of medieval plaster casts of hundreds of them. They're the same objects that they have at the V&A, because they have a very similar collection. I think our casts are copies of those casts rather than from the original objects, but some of those are copies of objects that then in the original collections, the original objects got destroyed in World War II. So we have these casts in Australia, and I'm sure we're not the only copies in the world, but definitely there's this sort of, sometimes you have to study the copy if the original is gone or has degraded. I wonder, there's the Trajan's Column one in the V&A. I don't know, is that how's that going in relation compared to Trajan's Column, which is actually outside, for example?
Actually, just a parallel there, by the way, of course, the most of Book 1 of Valerius Maximus is missing, and it's reconstructed from the two epitomes of it. So you actually have the deliberately lesser, in the sense of smaller, versions that have been used to reconstruct the original preserved in the volume.
That's your next exhibition, then, sure. Brilliant.
So from what I can see in the comments, we have no further questions. Last chance for our panel. Are there any questions from us at all? Otherwise, if not, I'd really like to thank Alina and Sarah again for today's session, and also wish you good luck for your forthcoming publication. Secondly, I would like to remind all our viewers that the next session of Digital Classicist London 2026 is on June 26th. This will be an online and in-person session, and please register via the link that should be at the bottom of your YouTube screen. And a reminder of the time, this will take place at 5 p.m. British Summer Time. Having said that, thank you very much for joining in, and have a wonderful rest of the day or night, as may be the case. Goodbye, everyone.